Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So 2 segments for you all today. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the German election, which is scheduled for several days after we record this. When you listen to this, the election may have already been held, but we'll talk about what's at stake there. But first, a related segment. The data point there is $500 billion. That is the value of the deal that the United States has reportedly requested Ukraine sign on to. Deal might be a generous way to put what is essentially a request to extract some of Ukraine's value in the form of minerals, rights to infrastructure and ports in Ukraine.
They have tremendously valuable land in terms of rare earth, in terms of oil and gas, in terms of other things. I want to have our money secured because we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, and you know, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal.
We are now obviously 3 years into the war in Ukraine that was started when Russia invaded that country. And yeah, at this point, hundreds of thousands have died. Millions have been displaced. A lot of unpredictable things have happened, but perhaps the most unpredictable thing of all has been happening in the last several weeks as the United States, Ukraine's biggest backer and ally, has in some ways ostensibly switched sides, backing Russia's interpretation of the war and negotiating to end it on terms that are favorable to Russia, it seems like. And that's led to a breakdown of relations with Ukraine. And we thought we'd check in generally on how Ukraine is doing 3 years into this war and amid all this turmoil. So to start off with, Adam, that deal that I mentioned that the Trump administration reportedly offered Ukraine, is this a deal that, on the most basic terms, that Ukraine can even afford to accept?
I mean, like you say, Cam, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what words to use to describe this. It's on its face, and it's difficult to know whether to take it at face value, an extraordinary act of extortion. I mean, it's not unheard of for foreign creditors to want security. It's quite common, in fact. But to transform a relationship that since the beginning of the war was cast in very different terms, all of a sudden, in retrospect, into this sort of hard-nosed bargain, well, it's devastating to the previous American interpretation of what this war was about. And it doesn't, why I'm sort of holding back from, is it doesn't make any sense on its face, right? Because the Trump claims for the scale of American aid to Ukraine are exaggerated by a factor of 2 to 2.5, right? So most sensible calculations estimate that it's about 120 billion or so. The EU, taken together, has been a larger backer of Ukraine than the United States. The significance of US support has been that it's been in the form of military hardware that no one else can quite supply in those terms, and intelligence and so on. And so even from a purely business point of view, it doesn't, there's no equivalence here unless Trump is somehow cashing out the value of future security guarantees, which his diplomats have been very reluctant to extend. And then you look at the mineral deposits themselves, and experts in mineral deposits will tell you they're all based on out-of-date Soviet geological surveys, and the minerals per se are not worth very much. They have to be developed, they have to be explored. And none of that's actually being done. So the whole thing has this ludicrous kind of cosplay. I mean, he's enacting a pantomime version of a villain, which isn't really villainous. It doesn't really add up to a substantial plan for the extraction of actual resources from Ukraine, and yet nevertheless completely demolishes and destroys the frame of legitimacy that was wrapped around Western aid for Ukraine, whilst clearly indicating the worst possible of intent, right? So it's like, if you did have bad intent, you'd think you would disguise it. If you were serious about economic exploitation, you'd actually have to be certain there was something to be exploited. It's just very unclear what this does, other than satisfy a basic Trumpian instinct that America has been ripped off. It was ripped off in Iraq. Remember, he ran a very similar kind of line on Iraq, which was that he didn't understand why America had spilt all this blood and treasure and hadn't ended up with the oil, right? This was this bizarre, crude refrain, whereas I think everyone actually understood that insofar as there was any profitable oil to extract, American companies had been offered it, and then it turned out it wasn't actually a business they wanted to be in. And so the whole thing has what it's clearly from the Ukrainian point of view is it's profoundly shocking, it's profoundly insulting, and they should definitely say no. The question is what the consequences of that will be, because it's difficult to know whether Washington can possibly mean this seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about this in the most generous possible terms, this extractive deal that the United States is offering Ukraine, again, on the scale of $500 million, much more than the total aid the United States has offered till now to begin with. But I was sort of trying to think through history if there are analogs to this from the U.S. perspective. And, in terms of driving a hard economic bargain with allies, when it comes to World War II, I know the Lend-Lease program with Britain was this famously generous program to Britain as it was fighting World War II. But prior to that, I remember that there was this cash and carry policy with Britain where, Britain was already at war. The United States was ostensibly allied with it, but demanded payment for its assistance, and to the point of effectively bankrupting Britain, if I'm understanding that correctly. So, I mean, I guess I bring it up to ask, where exactly can we determine the dividing line between a self-interested policy and an outright punitive policy that's meant to disrupt and harm another country?
I mean, I think maybe the best way to start is not to start with the question of altruism and self-interest, right? I mean, after all, ultimately, all policy is in some sense self-interested. It doesn't make sense. Altruism itself is a matter of casting oneself as the good guy, right? So it's better, I think, to maybe look at the form that takes, and there has indeed been quite the repertoire of options in US European history, and it's kind of interesting to go back through it. Your question really prompted me to do that, because the beginning in World War I, not World War II, when America's government under Woodrow Wilson had not yet really begun to think of itself as the preeminent hegemonic actor, was only beginning to figure it out, was not in fact government aid at all. It was private aid. So that was a situation where JP Morgan organized very large-scale private American investment in the Anglo-French-Russian war effort, issued a bunch of bonds, and they bought stuff for that money, which had the effect of entangling American savers in the Allied war effort, but kept it unpolitical. And then when America is dragged into the war by German aggression, you get the Liberty loans, which is the first time where you have loans raised by the American government, which wasn't in the habit of doing that very much since the Civil War. Loans being raised by the American government, but the proceeds being channeled to the Allies. So that then was intergovernmental debt backed by democracies on both sides. So you start with the American bourgeoisie financing the Entente war effort, and then you end up with the American government as an associate in the war, not an ally, note, but nevertheless an associate co-funding the war effort. And that led to disastrous entanglements in interwar politics, which I wrote about in that book, Deluge. It's the flip side of the reparations deal. It's a nightmare. And by the 1930s, the genuinely isolationist Congress of the 30s decided there was not going to be any subsequent repeat of this, because the British and the French by the 30s had both defaulted on those debts which the American public had taken out on their behalf. And so there was a ban, and yet nevertheless the FDR people wanted to enable the British and the French to help themselves to the resources of the US state. And so that's when cash and carry comes in, which is precisely no lending from the United States, but anything you can pay for with cash, you can carry out of the United States. You have also to be able to carry it out on your own ships. And effectively, of course, the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese couldn't do this. So really, this was an offer to the British and the French. If you can do this without credit, you can come get it. The problem with that is they run out of purchasing power. And it's after Roosevelt's re-elected in November 1940 that you then get Lend-Lease introduced the following spring. And that avoids all of this entanglement again in another structure, which is we'll buy the stuff and then we'll lend it to you. And so in some cases, you can lease it from us. In other words, the money never changes hands. The money always stays within the US. The deals are done for the American businesses. The British and the Chinese and the Russians end up with the equipment, but it remains in the American possession. You never have any kind of financial counterpart. And then after the war, to add a further layer, they go back to doing interstate loans. Those work about as well as they did the first time. By 47, it's a bust. And then they introduce the Marshall Plan, which is the kind of non plus ultra of American magnanimity, which is an overwhelmingly grants-based program with the additional wrinkle that the Europeans have to match it. So whatever money the Americans put in, the Europeans have to raise in their own currency. And then there's 10% of it, which is in the form of loans, and the Americans use those loans to lever down all other loans in the European system. So there you have like almost a complete geometry, a complete repertoire of different geometries for doing this. And the Ukraine aid to date has been a mixture of grant and various types of loan obligation. And the Trump suggestion is simply the crudest. There hasn't ever been quite anything like this in the repertoire of American power since the beginning of the early 20th century. It's real gunboat diplomacy type stuff. If you were serious about this, like in the pre-1914 period, the Europeans were, what you'd say is that, we'll build you a railway to develop these rare earth deposits. We'll lend you the money. And then from the proceeds of the rare earth exports that will happen as a result of us actually exporting them, we will have first claim. We'll hypothecate, the first 70% of revenue will go to us. Now, if you were really in the business of making a grotesque neo-imperial offer, that's probably what it would look like. What Trump is waving around doesn't look like that right now, to my mind. We don't know the full details of this proposal. It was leaked to the Telegraph. It's all a little bit vague, but the sort of boisterous nonsense we get from Trump, generally speaking, doesn't add up to actually a concrete business proposal at all.
So what's happened in parallel with these negotiations with Ukraine are negotiations between the United States and Russia. In Saudi Arabia, there have been direct talks between both governments, and they put out a statement after those talks stipulating that both countries were looking forward to continued discussions about the war in Ukraine, but more generally about cooperating on their joint geopolitical and economic interests. And again, this is all quite new in the context of this war, and I'm curious, what common interests might they be having in mind? What are the joint economic interests, say, that the United States and Russia share?
Well, I mean, it's sort of this weird combination of the appearance of ultra-realist, hard-nosed power politics and a giant pile of bullshit, right? I mean, it's this very, very strange combination of things. Like, because if you had looked at the world in 2019 or 2018 and had said to yourself, okay, the great antagonist of the United States is China, we should do a reverse Kissinger and we should tie the Russians to us, that would have made a certain sort of sense. And I think certain people thought maybe that's what Trump 1.0 would do, and it didn't happen. But in the early stages of the Biden administration, the Biden people, I think, were trying to reset the relationship with Putin. I mean, Obama had tried as well. It didn't fail for want of American trying. It failed because of Putin's headlong aggression against Ukraine, which Trump is now denying, right? So the insanity of this is, of course, it would make sense in some sense to organize an American-Russian bloc against China. I mean, everyone has been saying this forever. The problem is not that doesn't make sense. The problem is that Russia isn't the actor that we think we are. And we can't now pretend 3 years into this war that somehow Russia actually is different. No, I mean, unless, of course, you're willing to buy all the deluded stuff. And the Russians, of course, are only too happy to play into this exaggerated, bullshitty tendency of the Trump administration. So they apparently came to these meetings in Saudi with the claim that American business was either losing or foregoing, and the accountancy is a little bit vague here, $324 billion in losses that had been suffered by American business as a result. And you can see the way this works. You just say Zelensky has 5% support and American business has lost $324 billion, and all of a sudden you've got yourself a deal, right? And the reality, of course, is the devil's in the detail, and it's not true that Zelensky's support is 5%, and it's not true that American businesses have lost $324 billion either. The best estimate that we have for Western business losses in Russia is somewhere around the $120 to $140 billion euro mark, and those are real. We think there's about 160 billion euros worth of assets still trapped in Russia in various forms. Difficult to get out of that business right now. The only way that you get to a loss of 324 billion for American business is either you just make it up or you somehow project massive gains that have been foregone as a result of exiting the, oh so prosperous Russian market that would generate these huge returns, which is presumably how the Russians, they're not crazy people. They presumably somehow came up with a number that way. The reality is that, of course, there are serious business interests which have lured the West into relationships with Russia, and they have done so ever since the late 19th century. It was Western interests that developed the Russian oil fields, then Tsarist oil fields in Azerbaijan and Baku. And it was from the 90s onwards Western energy interests that piled in Europe. In Germany, they agonize endlessly about gas, but in fact, the big revenue generator is oil. And it isn't German firms in the first instance, which are the leaders there, but the big Western oil majors, which all partner up in various oligarchic relationships. And that presumably is what's on the horizon again, right? Exxon took big losses from its Sakhalin investments. Total, the French major, Shell, BP has an incredibly checkered history in Russia. Of course, there are German interests, but they are overwhelmingly in gas because the Germans are not a player in the oil business. And that presumably is the direction. And there are consumer firms that are interested in Russia. It's a big middle income market and it has pockets of real prosperity and affluence like Moscow. And so it makes sense to invest there. There's profits to be made. So at that level, it's not pie in the sky, and one can imagine even more extensive things in, Antarctica, but that does take you into the kind of realm of fantasy. The real serious, as the Germans would say, handfest, graspable interests. But the problem is not whether or not there are interests. The problem is not whether or not you can see a strategic opportunity. The problem is that Putin started a war gratuitously with Ukraine, and there's only so far you're going to get in denying that fact, right? Which apparently is what the Trump administration has set itself to do. But it's, truth will bite them at some point in one form or another. Either the Ukrainians will just say no, the Europeans will say no, or Putin will act true to character and be totally disruptive to whatever relationship they agree. The Chinese, after all, thought they had a deal with Putin, and he didn't even inform them ahead of time about the invasion of Ukraine. So what kind of a partner is this that they're talking about? That's the issue. The issue is not whether or not you can't see opportunity. The question is whether it's real, whether anyone reasonable would imagine it would be real at this point. And that's why it's so infuriating that we're having these conversations, because it's perfectly obvious that given what's happened since 2022, all of this is nonsense. I mean, you're not going to get big American businesses to invest in Russia at this point. They're not crazy.
Yeah, and yet, given the constellation of these negotiations, it does seem like the outcome will be some kind of lopsided deal with Russia and Ukraine in Russia's favor. And that got me wondering about Ukraine's future in the West, if in fact it's suffering this lopsided deal and is subject to continued Russian aggression. I mean, could a kind of failed Ukraine, I mean, the Trump administration has clarified that it likely wouldn't enter NATO, but there's still talk of it entering the EU in some way. And then Russia hasn't spoken quite as disfavorably of that as it has of NATO membership. It got me wondering if, a kind of failed Ukraine could be a Trojan horse almost in the EU. In the event of this kind of failed peace, could Russia even kind of welcome deeper Ukrainian integration into the West as a way of Russia itself gaining more influence in Europe?
I mean, that's why, European states led by Germany most prominently until 2022 vigorously resisted any suggestion that Ukraine would ever become. Even before Russia invaded and war launched, as the Ukrainians will say, full-scale invasion, even before the invasion of the Donbass happened in 2014, the Europeans had zero interest in full membership for Ukraine. It's too big, it's too agrarian, it's too poor, it's too obviously problematic from a geopolitical point of view, and its politics were too fragile. Its democratic credentials were too fragile in the Yanukovych regime that was felled by the great demonstrations in 2013 was legitimately, it wasn't a clean election by any standards, but everyone agreed that it was as good as Ukraine was going to produce, and it was a pro-Russian government that was elected there. So Ukraine really looked profoundly unappetizing to the EU. It's somewhat surprising in light of that the Russians didn't already at that time have the sense to stand back and just watch the action. Instead, What they did was, found their own customs union, act all upset about the fact that Ukraine was drifting towards the EU orbit. If they'd been cool about it, they would just simply have allowed the mess to play out the way it was playing out at the time, which is that there's no momentum on the part of the EU outside really extraordinary circumstances to extend to Ukraine. Really zero, none. Because it's obviously a gigantic problem, a type they've not faced before on this scale. And so now it's even more problematic. I think the hardcore of strategic reason why Moscow might actually resist Ukraine's move towards Europe, it's not obvious why this works on the European side, but it certainly works on the Ukrainian and the Russian side as a logic and produces conflict, is not so much the national policy dimension of this, which from the point of view of the EU and its major member states is a disaster. It tips everyone, including Poland, for instance, from being net recipients of EU aid to being net contributors, because Ukraine is so poor and needs so much help. The real issue, I think, for Moscow is that EU accession would change the balance of popular opinion in Ukraine. And so long as they cling to the idea, as I think Putin continues to do, that deep down the Ukrainians don't know who they are or don't want to be independent and actually know they belong with Russia, that's what EU accession would change. It's not the policy level, it's the fact that it would become irreversible at the level of the population of Ukraine. So in a backhanded way, the lack of logic on the Russian side is a kind of backhanded compliment to the fundamentally democratic process which has unfolded in Ukraine, which is that the population has increasingly asserted its own interests against those of oligarchy on the one hand and Russian influence on the other. And from the point of view of individual Ukrainians and their families and their communities, it's clear that access to West European labour markets or just Central European labour markets is key, which is why so many of the migrants have been so successfully integrated, and quite a few of them clearly aren't going to want to go home to Ukraine. And so that, I think, is the real worry on Russia's part. But this is you're right. I think most recently Russian negotiators have begun rather strikingly to say that they draw the line on NATO because it's security, but they frankly acknowledge the Ukrainians' right to join the EU. That's not previously been their position. Given our terrible circumstances now, it's a step in the right direction, one hesitates to say. But yes, is this a huge challenge coming Brussels, Berlin, Paris's way? It is. Are they ready for it at this point? No, not even close.
So then, I guess to end, I thought we could take a step back just to look at Ukraine's status right now as an agent in all of these events that are ongoing. It is quite stunning just to see the way that the country has become an object of negotiations, the way it's being presented with outcomes perhaps, and finding itself unable to make choices about its own future. And I guess I wonder, obviously it is still independent, but has Ukraine in some sense already lost its sovereignty? And I guess one other way of phrasing the question is, we've talked before on this podcast about how resistance has given the country agency. But are we seeing right now that resistance has its own limits, and maybe that's what we're witnessing?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say this question made me feel quite indignant, because it's tempting to say that absolutely nothing's happened so far except that America's leadership has humiliated itself. Nothing has happened. Trump has just made a fool of himself and his country and the people that voted for him. Nothing that's being talked about in Saudi Arabia. The Russians walked away from it going, folks, it's far too early to agree anything here. You guys want to rush to some conclusion, but hey, we think this was a useful start. That's all that happened. Right? And from a broader perspective, all that's happened is that the United States has really, for the foreseeable future, forfeited its standing as a reliable partner. That this could put Ukraine in very difficult circumstances is clear. But if, sovereignty, actual sovereignty, consists in the willingness to bear a cost to assert your autonomy, I mean, who under the present circumstances looks more sovereign, Ukraine or Germany? Ukraine is a country which has paid the price for asserting its autonomy and has done so. And if they have to accept a humiliating peace, will that subvert their sovereignty? You'd still say, at a fundamental level, no. Versailles didn't end Germany's sovereignty. They were forced to accept a humiliating peace, right? It constrained them in various ways. They hated, they sacrificed territory they hated. Nationalists then said, we're slaves. But it wasn't the reality of the situation, because the contrast is only obvious after 45, when millions of people are moved around and there isn't a state. So I think we're jumping the gun when we say that sovereignty is infringed here. Another way of putting the same point was that in the current state system, there aren't that many sovereigns. There aren't that many true sovereigns. If you combine, true, independence of political system with not just the ability technically to declare the exception, but the political muscle necessary to do it and to pay the price collectively to assert it, it's a relatively small number of countries for whom that is tried and tested. And you'd have to say it would include Ukraine. And it's not at all obvious that it includes Germany, where it's not clear that it's capable or that its population is interested in paying the price, even if it's quite trivial, to mobilize the resources necessary for a minimum of national defense. Right? And that's not a scandal. It's not a slander. It's just the reality of politics, right? This was always inherent in the Schmittian definition. Sovereignty is to a degree a choice, right? It's a capacity that you can either build or not, or choose not to build. And Ukraine has, at the price of incredible, heroic sacrifice, built a capacity that very, very few states in the world have, which is to sustain a war like this. And there are other examples, more bullying examples. Israel would be a classic case of a state which clearly exerts sovereignty to a really dramatic extent. Russia does, which is why there is this weird extreme left, extreme right-wing coalition of Putin fans in Europe, and it turns out in a weird way also now in Washington, because they appreciate the kind of winner-takes-all version of state power that Putin embodies. So, it's that quip that's going around, if Trump is right and Zelensky is a dictator, why doesn't he admire him? It's this, of course, it's Zelensky isn't a dictator, but in fact what he's doing is exactly what republics under conditions of extreme circumstance have always done, which is to appoint exceptional war powers and carry on the struggle. So no, I wouldn't describe, I think Ukraine is under massive pressure. It is now at the whim and the behest of a totally capricious government in the United States. But Ukraine has remarkable resources and it actually has quite a lot of allies. And it's difficult to know at this point exactly how this is going to end. Could it end very badly for Ukraine? Yes, clearly. But I think there's also a scenario in which the entity which appears to come out of this with its reputation and standing most damaged is clearly the United States. It isn't just a liberal preconception that the exercise of state power in ways radically different to Trump it's not just a vanity, right? It's actually based in what we think, us liberals, is a profound understanding of how international power actually operates. And you can't flaunt that, even if you are entitled by the American electorate to do it. You can't flaunt that without paying a price. And these are unusual circumstances. No one has been in the business of inflicting that price on America for a while. But given the dynamic that's been unleashed here, it wouldn't be surprising, I think, if that's what the long-run tendency is. We'll say more about this when we talk about Germany and European independence from the United States. But America is acting as though its allies don't matter, and that may be true, but it's hard to see that this enhances America's power.
Yeah, point taken, that obviously political will is a factor constraint in evaluating sovereignty, but yeah, so is power, as I guess you were just describing. And the way I guess we just use the term sovereignty in general is belied by the way it operates in, political practice. We'll see how this unfolds, and whether the liberal conception of power operates at wartime in these extreme moments. I do think that application is an interesting question, but we should stop this conversation for now. We'll continue a related one as we switch over to the topic of Germany and its election after this break. Hi, welcome back. Our next data point is 181,570. That is the total number of active troops in the Bundeswehr, that is Germany's national military. That is probably not enough and has not been enough for a long while, and that's now becoming increasingly clear as talk increases of potentially Germany sending troops to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire there. But this topic has not come up in the past several weeks of Germany's national political campaign as the country sets out to select a new national government. The campaign has covered all sorts of topics, the welfare state and social security payments, tax levels, and above all, migration. But in the last several weeks, those topics have seemed somewhat beside the point in light of all that's happening in Europe and the United States, as we just talked about in our first segment on Ukraine. So yeah, we thought we would talk about Germany, and to take off from our conversation about Ukraine, there was just an emergency meeting held in Paris by Emmanuel Macron, the president of that country, of France, at which various other European leaders discussed Europe's potential response to the crisis that the Trump administration has started in Ukraine. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor in Germany, has responded to the kind of request for peacekeeping troops in Ukraine in a somewhat obstinate way that's not untypical of Scholz's demeanor. He let it be known that he was, quote, irritated that the topic even came up. So I guess if we were to set aside Scholz's position, I'm curious whether Germany on a logistical level can even manage to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. I mean, would that weaken its other military commitments? Does it have sufficient spare capacity to be playing this kind of role at all?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very telling moment, I think. And it's quite difficult to get concrete information on the actual deployable strength of the Bundeswehr, what it can actually do. They are supposed to be building a permanent presence, which is new, of 5,000 men, a kind of brigade strength unit in Lithuania, which is notably to deter the Russians. They are supposed, as far as I'm able to establish by looking back through NATO planning documents, are supposed to have one single division, ready for mobilization for combat over a 10 to 30 day time horizon. This is the 10th Panzer Division, which incorporates bits of the Dutch army as well. So if we say a beefed up division would be in the 20,000 men range, men and women, I think at this point, that would be probably about as much fighting strength as the Bundeswehr has. I think we'd be erring on the high side if we said they had 30,000 troops that are actually capable of fighting. And we know, that's one battle in the Ukrainian conflict. That would seem to be about the number of units that the Germans have as capable units. And I think testing them in practice has been somewhat embarrassing. In the maneuvers of 2024, things didn't go well. A lot of equipment broke down. And then there's the logistical element that you bring in, which is, could these units be moved? And this is where the full extent of the Germans would call it the Misere, the malaise, really becomes evident, because all the way back to the 19th century, the Germans were pioneers in using railways as means of moving troops. And for heavy units like armored brigades and divisions, the railway remains essential for long distance travel, because you can't drive a 60-ton tank from Germany to Ukraine and expect it still to be functioning. And if these are not peacekeeping units, but actually part of a security guarantee for Ukraine, in other words, they're actually deterrent forces, then they need to have heavy equipment with them. They can't just be lightly armored, like in somewhere like Kosovo or somewhere like that. They need actually to be capable of deterring the Russians. And so then the question becomes, can the Germans actually move a division-sized unit with any kind of speed across their increasingly run-down railway system? And the conclusion seems to be that they can't. So there was a report by the German Council of Foreign Relations last summer, which actually asked this question. Germany is non-trivial in NATO's logistical system, because everything has to go through Germany if we imagine the Eastern Front as the main arena. And as you know, since you live in Germany, its transport system right now is in a very poor state. The German Council of Foreign Relations estimated that Germany would need 30 billion euros in investment in its railways, in its bridges. The entire apparatus of NATO military mobility that was once hardwired into the German transport infrastructure has been dismantled. There used to be signs on every bridge. If you remember back from my childhood, across West Germany, basically all of the infrastructure was labeled for whether it was usable by NATO vehicles, and there were regular maneuvers in the summer where you could see the tank tracks. All of that's gone. One American military expert estimates that the Bundesbahn has the capacity to move 1.5 armored brigades at any given moment, which is an armored brigade is about 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers, 90 big American M1 Abrams tanks, some howitzers, some infantry fighting vehicles. So, a drop in the ocean of a big war. And this has already had concrete implications and concrete impact, because a congressional inquiry recently exposed that over the winter of 2022 to 2023, when the NATO and the Americans were trying to hustle huge quantities of ammunition to Ukraine, or better, shall I say, whatever ammunition they could find to build up Ukraine's stocks ahead of what we expected to be their summer offensive in 23, there was actually a 2-month hiatus when the relationship between the Bundesbahn and the American military command broke down, and they weren't able to move any ammunition and ended up moving it instead on water by boat, by barge, because they couldn't make it go on the railway. So I think there are quite fundamental issues raised, and it's really quite a good lens through which to view the general self-incapacitation of the German state. It goes back to this question about sovereignty. I mean, this is a choice on the part of the German political class to render itself incapable of doing something which for 160 to 70 years was taken for granted, that Germany, of all countries in the world, could move soldiers to a battlefield by railway at pace on a huge scale. That is what made Germany into the modern state that it is. That's literally how they won the war against the French in 1870. And it's very unclear that they can even move a division with any kind of speed across their current railway system.
Well, yeah, this becomes much more stark in light of the new geopolitical positioning of the United States. I was in Munich last week when J.D. Vance gave what's now become a infamous speech in which he attacked Western European democracies for their alleged lack of democratic practice at home. And the response by policymakers was essentially to describe the United States as an enemy, as an adversary of Europe now. And for me, this raised the question of, if that's the case, how long would it take for Europe to, effectively separate from the United States in terms of its military dependence? If they need to pursue some kind of orderly decoupling, what would that even look like? And where's the additional money going to come from? Again, following the German election, any increase in military spending is described in very stark terms in terms of the German budget. So, will countries like Germany need to make a choice between its welfare state and its defense in this new geopolitical context?
I mean, the short answer to this is it's totally doable. The Americans have been asking the Europeans to do more for ages. That this has caught them as flat-footed as they are is nothing but their own fault. After all, Trump won was a clear warning that this was a real issue, and Putin's aggression is not, after all, something sudden. And furthermore, and this is sort of the paradox of all of this, is that Europe already, right now, spends enough money, $342 billion in 2024, to pay for a military that would be certainly the third largest and most potent and technologically sophisticated in the world after the United States and China, right? But you would need to spend that as a single unit in a concerted way. You would need to focus it not on the sprawling mess that is European militarism and its detritus today, but on a highly trained army of, I don't know, for that kind of money, you'd be talking a military of 300, 400, 500,000 soldiers, something like that, across all three arms, with a tight focus on ground deterrence, superiority in technology and aircraft, and then some naval deployment, which you'd have to decide what you were actually going to use it for. But that kind of money, 342 billion euros, is perfectly adequate to do the task. And then you'd say, well, surely the problem is technological dependence on the US. And that's true up to a point. But I was looking at some figures for German military procurement over recent years that were compiled by the Kiel Institute. And they were very instructive, because Germany spent 135 billion euros between 2020 and 2024 on new military kit. And some of the high-profile orders that they put out are notoriously the F-35 program, which is, of course, the American giant aircraft program, or then the new Sky Shield missile program, where they've even ordered missiles from Israel. But non-European foreign orders within German military procurement, when you look beyond the headlines, account for only 17% of the total. Half of it is Germany internal, and the rest is with European partners. So though there are some marquee items which the Germans are choosing for various reasons to acquire from the United States or Israel, the vast majority of their spending is in fact within Europe already. Now, there are big areas of deficits where they would have to catch up fast. But the idea that, the continent that boasts Airbus, which is right now the only, reliable producer of large volumes of commercial aircraft, is not in a position to produce perfectly adequate, meeting all of the necessary requirements, military equipment for the present day is just clearly fallacious. But it's a matter of political will. It requires you actually to concentrate that resource and Merz, the prospective winner of the German election, is actually very strong on this because he's campaigned for ages for a European army. And it's the obvious way to go. Under those circumstances, it would take years. It would be a matter of decades to disentangle yourself from the United States. And you might ask yourself, do you really want to be fully disentangled from the US? Probably not. Why would you do that? It's cheaper in many ways to acquire arms from other people, and it exerts, you have more influence as the customer really than you do as the supplier in many ways, though the supplier is necessary. But there's no reason why Europe couldn't do this. And even if it involved extra spending, say you wanted to raise it to 3.5% of GDP from the barely 2% that they're spending now, Europe's GDP is 20 trillion euros plus. The debt to GDP level across all of Europe is in the mid-80s%. Germany's debt to GDP ratio is just over 60%. So if this needed to be financed, that doesn't present a fundamental challenge. This is investment expenditure in rebuilding state capacity, rebuilding sovereignty, to harp on that theme. It's perfectly legitimately financed through debt. There's nothing else that would be more important to finance than that, other than long-range environmental in that expenditure and presumably up maintaining the digital infrastructure of Europe. So if you think of those as the three prongs, this is the Draghi agenda of the summer of 2024. We know what kind of order of magnitude is necessary, and it would need to be some combination of nation-state, pan-European, and private investment to do this. But we shouldn't exaggerate the threats. The only one that really matters for Europe is Russia, and Russia is a deterrable state as far as Europe is concerned.
So if, in fact, the United States is an adversary, does Germany need to be rethinking its own foreign policy? And does it need to be balancing against the United States? In part, I suppose, by redeveloping closer ties with Russia. I've already seen this kind of rhetoric come up a bit in the election campaign. Some are advocating for removing sanctions from Russia, so Germany has a greater choice of gas imports, effectively creating leverage with the United States over LNG purchases. I guess this raises the question more generally for me. I mean, is Russia in this context, ultimately more important for Germany, closer to its fundamental interests than even Ukraine is in this new context?
Well, I mean, I think 2 points. The first is that I think to regard the United States as an antagonist on the basis of, Vance's culture wars posturing and Trump being the unpredictable hazard that he is, I think would be a mistake. Is the United States a reliable ally? No. Does it pose risks? Yes. Would the Europeans be well advised to see to their own defense and to hedge against the unpredictability of the US? Yeah, sure. But to engage in a systematic balancing strategy against the United States, I think really takes this to a level that's, far beyond anything that would make any sense. I mean, in economic policy, you can see that a little bit because the Trump tariff policy is so aggressive that it actually threatens to damage Europe. Whereas in security areas, Americans are basically say to the Europeans, look after yourself. And in the trade policy area, we are seeing some balancing. So there is, an outreach to Canada. There's an outreach to Latin America as a way of maybe balancing the US. But I think as a broader strategy, it would make sense to look to your own defenses and to hedge, but it wouldn't make sense to counterbalance. And to counterbalance with Russia, makes Like even, we have to come back to this point. Just because Trump and co are normalizing Putin, the rest of us don't have to get on board with this. That doesn't make any sense, right? If you think Trump is unreliable, why on earth would you imagine that you'll find some kind of safety with Putin? And in any case, Trump has already got there before you, right? Like you're not going to get an edge on Trump by means of a relationship with Putin. But to go to your fundamental point, of course, Russia is far more important to Germany than Ukraine, which is why up to 2022, Germany prioritized its relations with Russia over its prior relations with Ukraine. Germany was heavily invested in Russia. Russia was a strategic relationship. Of course it was. The problem was not for want of trying or for want of prioritization. It was just that Russia's very difficult to deal with, right? And the cost and the price that you pay, as we've now discovered, is really exorbitant. And it was, in fact, foolish policy to rely on Russia to the extent that Europe did. I'm not in the camp that damns Merkel in retrospect, right? It was a consensus across German policymaking, and a sensible consensus that Germany needed good relations and invested relations with Russia as its great eastern neighbor. But it isn't on the Western side that calculus blew up. It's on the Russian side that calculus blew up. I think China probably imagined it was balancing the United States with Russia and has ended up embarrassed by that calculus. So yes, all of these things come into play. But to my mind, the strategy for Europe should be a mega Switzerland. It should be very, very well defended. It should focus its politics inward and try and sort it itself out the way the Swiss do. It should be less judgmental, perhaps, in its relationships with other powers, other than the question being, how predictable are they? Do they act in a capricious and dangerous and aggressive way? And that should be really the future of European security strategy, is a kind of mega neutrality around a set of interests which clearly do enormously benefit the Europeans, most notably multilateral trade and finance and commerce. So, I mean, that if you're offering a kind of, it's not a return to Ostpolitik, it's a move towards, that would be the West German policy of trying to embrace the Soviet Union as a way of, overcoming national division. It should at this point be a more considered strategy of, building a European bloc that can set its own terms, and relies less on external props.
So if we were to turn now to the election campaign proper in Germany, and I guess if we were to take two of the big issues of the day, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and also, as I mentioned, immigration, which has been dominating the campaign for most of its duration, I'm curious how the party system in Germany breaks down when it comes to these issues. And specifically, if we were to take the center-right CDU party, which has been leading in the polls the entire time, is likely to emerge as the winner under Friedrich Merz's leadership. How does the center-right align between the center-left parties that it's likely to create a coalition with and the far-right party, the AfD, that the Trump administration has been encouraging the CDU essentially to pursue a relationship with? I mean, where does the CDU align with those other parties on these big issues?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the CDU AfD axis as the sort of center of this question, then on immigration, there's no question, I think, that the Christian Democrats, as opposed to the Social Democrats and the Greens, align much more closely with the restrictive, xenophobic, Islamophobic stance of the AfD. And Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU, who in some ways is a kind of pro-European Atlanticist, former business consultant, mainstreamer, opened the question of migration and in fact tore down what's called the firewall, which has supposed to bind all of the establishment parties of German politics in an agreement that none of them would do business with the AfD. And he actually tore that down and launched a legislative proposal that could only possibly pass with AfD support. It was a huge scandal. And in the end, in fact, he was embarrassed because he didn't get the votes that he needed to pass it. But on that issue, I think there's no question at all that the alignment of the CDU is more clearly with the AfD. That one's also tempted at that point to say, this is also the issue on which the AfD is least distinctive, in some senses, quite contrary to the nonsense that Vance was purveying at Munich. The idea that Europe is some sort of, haven of liberal multiculturalism in which, no one has any interest or, in excluding migrants is belied by the reality of, well, everything in European history and politics. It's just nonsense. It's part of MAGA bullshit, right? It's just not true. Any more than it's true in the United States, where Biden and Obama were vigorous deporters of migrants. And Harris promised to be, much more serious about migrant deportation than Trump, right? There's the idea that somehow it's posturing. It's not really a considered position. It's a destructive posturing. It's racist. It's xenophobic, and it's Islamophobic. But that's kind of what it is. Where the AfD really does deviate from the increasingly consensual right-wing drift is precisely over Ukraine, NATO, and by implication, the relations with the United States. And there are two elements to this. One is that, the AfD's roots are in East Germany, and I don't think there's any question that there is a kind of lingering appreciation on the part of many voters, notably in the East, but also perhaps an appreciation also amongst left and right-wing voters in the West for the willingness of Putin to be a sovereign, to stand up, right, against global hegemony, global American liberal hegemony. And that, I think, is certainly on the more ideological side of the AfD, people like Björn Höcke, this is the key element. That what Putin represents is sovereigntism. I actually did a talk once to the Bundestag, its research service, on the issue of American financial hegemony, which I thought was an innocent topic and one I know about, and was really alarmed to discover who showed up for it, because it was exclusively members of the Bundestag from the far left and the far right, including Höcke and his entire team. And if there are people in Germany who want to talk openly about American power and its financial side, it is the extreme right. They're the people that break the consensus that somebody like Merz represents, which is that you don't openly talk about the dirty side of American power. Right? You accept it as a reality, you embrace it, you consider yourself privileged players within that system, but you don't actually ever explicitly state. Even things like the brutality of the post-war settlement are very difficult for mainstream German parties to articulate because they are the terrain of the far right. So that's where the AfD and the CDU are just completely at odds with each other. And in many ways, I think Merz's foreign policy program is closer to that of the Greens, who are kind of neocon in the American sense, values-based Atlanticists. And the SPD, who are old school, do a deal with Russia on the bounds of pragmatism because it's good for German industry and the trade union movement, are in a third position between the stools to a degree.
Yeah, I guess that brings me to my last question, which is about the topic that was supposed to dominate this campaign from the outset and has sort of faded away as it's gone along. And namely, that's the condition of the German economy. Obviously, Germany is Europe's largest economy, but in the last couple of years, it's actually shrunk. It's been in recession. 2024, it shrank by 0.2%, contracted in 2023 by 0.3%. Friedrich Merz, the likely next chancellor, has made a point of criticizing the previous government for its leadership over the economy. And he's also talked about how the German economic model as a whole is broken. But his prescriptions mostly seem to involve basically improving Germany's competitiveness, cutting costs, becoming more efficient, and basically keeping the economic model going in that way. But is that commensurate with what really is broken in terms of the German economic model?
Yeah, my mantra on this. What Germany needs is not more competitiveness, because competitiveness is code for exports, and that's precisely the wrong way to think about Germany's economic problems. Germany's chronic trade surplus, which they celebrate as a sign of their competitiveness, and they want more of it because that means they're more competitive, and that's a good thing, is in fact a symptom of a real problem, which might even be described as too much competitiveness, right? And why too much? Because you have to ask, why do German firms need to go looking for business abroad to such an extent? And the short answer is they do it because they don't have as big a market at home as they would need to achieve the efficiency and the scale that they do and to take advantage of their highly specialized skills. And why is this a problem? Not in the German case because consumption is too low. This deficit of demand at home doesn't have the same origins as it does in China. The problem in Germany is not that the savings rate is particularly high. What's chronically low in Germany is investment. And that's what Germany needs. It needs domestic investment to provide markets for Germany's capital goods industries. That investment would also heat up the economy even more. It would lead to more imports. It would therefore adjust Germany's chronic trade surplus towards something closer to balance. And what it would do is both create immediate demand in the German economy, but it would also create and provide the foundations for long-run growth, which is the thing which is most troubling to German society and which is beginning to show up in so many different places. And that's really the big issue. Now, Merz will tell you that, of course, he favors investment and everything he's trying to do is to increase investment. But what he has in mind is private investment. And there just really isn't any serious analysis of the German economy that will tell you that private investment can get you to the kind of levels of extra spending that are necessary. We're talking now, I think the latest estimates put the deficit for Germany alone at something like 500 billion euros, which need to be spent urgently over the next 10 years. And some of that can come from the private side, but it needs movement on the public sector side as well. And this is where Merz is just profoundly reluctant. So he seems to understand the problem. There's wide suspicion that he really deeply understands the problem, that he's holding back for political reasons, because the German electorate are convinced that more investment that's publicly funded means debt, and debt is bad. Whereas, of course, when you look at an economy like Germany's, you have to ask yourself why they don't have more debt-funded investment. So it's rather good news, and this has kind of been one of the beneficial effects of the shocks that Germany has been receiving from the Trump administration, is that Merz has actually begun to talk more open-mindedly about the possibility of common European debt-funded investment in defense. And this really would be a step in the right direction. He's also demanded that then not be spent nationally, that there be genuine European convergence, and that would make for an even better policy. So Merz, as the Atlanticist with a pro-European turn that actually opened the taps for debt, would be the sort of Merz-led government that we would need to address some of Germany's pressing issues. But investment is the key.
Somehow dispiriting that the investment that everyone can agree on is military spending exclusively, but I guess we'll take what you can get. And obviously whatever plans they come up with will depend on whatever coalition the German parties agree on, and that we'll know after the election results are in, and I'm sure we'll revisit at some point in the weeks ahead. But for now, we'll put this conversation to bring it to a close, and otherwise see you all again next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.